Welcome to the official preview of our latest feature releases here at 7Geese. Today we're excited to be demonstrating our latest feature, Company and Team Surveys, designed to help you take your employee experience to a whole new level through helping you focus, target, and measure the success of your people and culture initiatives. To introduce myself, I'm Libby Stewart, a talent specialist and evidence-based practitioner. And with 7Geese, I'm lucky enough to partner with hundreds of our customers globally in building a stronger performance culture as our Director of Customer Success and Professional Services.
And my name is Nick D'Angelo. I'm a solutions consultant at 7Geese, and I'll be walking us through the exciting new features that we're announcing. And as we walk through this today, feel free to send through your questions along the way. We will follow up after the tour. And if at any point you decide you would like a deeper dive with a one-on-one demonstration, there is an opportunity at the end of this tour to submit a request form for that. Or if you have to log off early, feel free to leave your details in the chat box. So for those that may not know 7Geese, we started around 9 years ago as the first digital OKR goal-setting app on the market. For those unaware of the OKR approach, this is a goal-setting framework first developed by Intel, then famously adopted by Google, now along with many other successful and forward-thinking organizations that wish to be more transparent and focused, and more importantly, allow their people to visibly see how their everyday work is strategically aligned to impacting company goals. While we know at 7Geese that goal setting is the central pillar of any strong performance ecosystem, we also know that there are actually a whole range of other intrinsic and extrinsic motivational factors that humans need in the workplace in order to thrive and reach their potential. In order to help our clients really tap into these motivational factors, we've evolved our product over time, incorporating more features along the way to help teams become even more effective at work and strive harder to achieve even more ambitious goals. The additional features that we've built along the way include one-on-ones for facilitating those critical coaching conversations between leaders and their teams, individual and peer feedback functionality to help improve in the day-to-day work through soliciting developmental feedback, values-based recognitions to recognize one another for behavior aligned with the company's core values, data-driven reviews that provide a regular indication of progress against goals based on real-time data, and the ability to create career and role profiles to enable and facilitate growth and personal development. In essence, partnering with our customers to build a really robust performance management ecosystem for their people. Most recently, and why we're here today, is because we have recently focused on taking our survey feature to the next level by enabling companies to generate stronger insights on how to engage their people and improve their employee experience.
So why care about tapping into employee experiences? And I recognize that we use the term employee experience a lot. There are a lot of buzzwords that get thrown around like employee engagement, culture, organizational climate, you name it. The question is, what does it all mean and why should we care? So simply put, no matter what you want to call it, we're now thankfully witnessing a massive shift where companies are starting to recognize that it's actually critical for our processes and practices to be far more people-centric. And at 7Geese, we know that we need to build one big performance ecosystem and really put our people in the heart of it. The reason we know this is important is because far too often we can see how these negative workplace experiences can be so harmful, not only to the individual themselves, but also to company culture and ultimately company performance as well. So when we're paying too little attention to how our people are experiencing their work environment, this can really then put us at risk of fostering those negative workplace experiences. So a perfect example of this, of course, one that easily comes to mind in our course of work is that of the traditional performance management approach. That once a year performance review conversation that were originally designed actually to give people a positive reward, such as a bump in salary, a promotion, or inspiring a new career goal or direction in people's work. It was all meant to be positive in the outset. But what actually happened? Well, clearly we weren't paying enough attention to how our people were actually receiving this whole process and how they felt. Were these once-a-year evaluation conversations really inspiring us to skip down the hallways and give these companies the absolute best years of our working lives? Probably not, and absolutely not, most people would probably answer. Instead, sadly, we know that actually people found these experiences either traumatizing, completely irrelevant, or at the very least, completely uninspiring for the majority of folks that were actually exposed to this kind of traditional practice. So we know these weren't driving positive experiences, and I'm sure that we can recall the instances of how they've actually harmed employee experiences in the workplace, which has led to things like impacting retention and, of course, impacting employee well-being as well. So then returning to my original question, why should we care about cultivating a positive employee experience? Well, in a nutshell, we know that positive experiences at work, whether they be social, ergonomic, or even positive interactions with our tech stack in enabling us to kind of go about our work without that everyday friction, will leave us feeling far more engaged and satisfied in the work that we're doing. We then know that engagement and that satisfaction is linked with more effort and investment into what we do. And in essence, this is what drives performance. And you don't have to just take my word for it, even though it sounds fairly logical. We actually know that this is real. Among many, many studies, there's been recent research out of MIT that shows companies that report positive employee experience index scores in the top quartile have been shown to actually have 25% higher profits than organizations with bottom quartile employee experience index scores. They also report twice the amount of innovation and double the customer satisfaction as well. So I think it's fairly safe to say that keeping your finger on the pulse of these experiences is essential and critical to managing and driving performance. So then the question now is how are we currently keeping a pulse on these experiences in our workplaces, and what are we doing about it? And right now, I truly believe it's more critical than ever to be regularly tapping into these experiences as we go through these unprecedented cultural shifts on a global scale and a local scale as well, meaning a lot of impacts to our workplace cultures as well. So in these turbulent times, it's super critical to ask ourselves, what can we do to make our people's experience better? Are we ensuring that we're preserving well-being? Do your people feel that they are currently working in an inclusive work environment? Have they found the shift to remote working conditions okay or reasonable? Are they getting the support that they need right now to do the best work that they need to do, or perhaps take a break from the work that they were doing in the past? Are they feeling focused and productive? And most importantly, no matter what we ask, we need to ask ourselves, are we actually listening to this feedback and following through with actions and commitments? So we know simply measuring and understanding these experiences are not enough. The challenge can often lie in converting the insights you've just uncovered and turn them into tangible, meaningful, timely actions to show that you've been listening. So how are those insights being translated to drive more positive workplace experiences for your people? And I know it shouldn't be a surprise, but there's a lot of research to back this up as well. So we know there's lots of reports out there showing that workers who see their employers acting on their feedback are actually 3 to 4 times more likely to stay with a company than employees who feel that their feedback is actually going nowhere and not impacting any kind of an outcome. So when we think about 3 to 4 times, that's actually a huge retention number. And we can see that feeling heard is really critical. So in essence, we really need to show people that we're asking, we're listening, and we're acting on these employee experience insights. So Nick, why don't you show us how we can get started on this process by giving us a tour of these new features?
So welcome back to 7Geese. For today's tour, we're going to be focusing on the feedback component. As you can see, there are several features that make up our ecosystem. The surveys feature lives within feedback, and that's because it has grown quite organically since feedback's humble beginnings as a peer-to-peer feedback tool, so that individuals can request feedback from one another whenever is appropriate, and you can pose it in specific ways so that the feedback is relevant to you and easy to collect, both from the responder side, but as well as the person actually requesting it. It has also adapted itself to a manager-led 360 so that you're not relying on people to request their own feedback. A manager or team lead of any kind can guide it to collect feedback on behalf of their direct reports. And most recently, it has grown into a company and team survey. So from here, you would be able to launch surveys for exactly that, your company or various teams within the company. Now, to help you get started, we do have a large library of best practice templates that may assist you. So this will come preloaded at no additional cost. It is included in the base package, and it is there as soon as you activate your account. So you'll be able to see all of these resources that we've prepared, and you'll be able to do with them whatever you please. You want to use them as is, go right ahead. You want to make some changes, you can do that as well. They're fully customizable, and you also have the freedom to completely ignore them and build your own from scratch if needed. So plenty of freedoms in terms of how you choose to get started and build your perfect survey. Now, once you start building your survey, let me open that back up. A few things go into it, but it's not too complicated to get started whether you start from our resources or build your own from scratch. So you can simply give it a title, choose who you would like to include, and we do have the ability to automate in HRIS details so that we can give you smart suggestions around things like your direct reports, your 360 group, but you can also run this, as mentioned, for various teams, as well as everybody. Then you have the freedom to make it anonymous if appropriate. This is actually a two-step anonymity. You'll see later on how you're able to collect it as a anonymous or identified, but if you collect it identified, you would then be able to curate and deliver a final report that may be anonymized, which may have its benefits, and we'll revisit this as you see that later on. But then you can also choose who will have visibility into the answers as they're being collected. Do you want the participants or the responders to see these answers? Or maybe you want specific groups potentially outside of that group, or maybe a selection of people within that group that you want to share this visibility with. Either way, these people will be able to see the live accumulation of the answers, but later on, after that curation stage I just mentioned, you will still have the freedom to share it wherever appropriate. So this isn't the be-all end-all, it's just an opportunity to share those resources as they're being collected. Then give it a deadline whenever needed. It can be a hard deadline or a soft deadline, saying better late than never. And then you can begin building your survey. So if you choose to use one of our templates, many of the questions will be pre-populated, but creating a survey from scratch is quite simple. You can simply type in the questions however you may choose to pose them, add additional context where needed, make any given question required versus optional, and then choose from a variety of question types, some of which are quite customizable, such as multiple choice, giving you multiple or single selection and customizable language, number scales with customizable degrees of the scale as well as language for the endpoints, as well as an opinion scale, also quite customizable in both language and degree. Then feel free to add in as many additional questions as you want. You can reorder them with a drag and drop, break them down into different sections, and organize all this information however might be appropriate for your needs. Then you're ready to start collecting. So you'll be able to collect all of your data in real time. As the facilitator, you'll have access to several tabs to help you move through this. Now, my response is one of the tabs here because in this example, I did choose to include myself. So that's what it looks like to answer a survey. Now, you and anyone given visibility can also view summary and individual answers. The summary you can see, based on the variety of answer types available, we will compile all of this data for you, whether it's an ENPS calculator, a multiple choice question, a number scale, an opinion scale, or good old-fashioned text. The individual breakdown is the same thing, but broken down by individual responder, and the purpose of this is to allow the facilitator to continue the conversation where needed. In many other survey tools, if you run an anonymous survey, you will hit a potential dead end if someone gives you an answer you weren't expecting. There's no ability to identify this person and carry on the conversation. Here, we can carry on the conversation without needing to identify that person. As the facilitator, you can comment on anyone's question or on their entire survey as a whole. They will then be alerted and have the freedom to respond without needing to identify themselves. So you can protect their identity, and even though we'll never know who this person is unless they choose to identify themselves, we can have a full conversation. So anonymity does not come at the cost of the conversation. Now, this final tab here, the shared report. So this is that curation stage I mentioned earlier. So between collecting your results and then sharing them with the appropriate individuals, the facilitator will have a control stage. So this is similar to the summary, because you will see that same summary, just like we saw before, being presented on the left side of the screen. But here we have the additional option to exclude any questions that we may deem irrelevant or unnecessary for any given reason. A very practical use for this function is to remove unconstructive feedback, typically with text, or alternatively, another very practical use is anybody that may have accidentally identified themselves. So if someone has put themselves at risk of being identified for any reason, we have the opportunity to protect their identity, remove that, and maybe even rephrase it so the right message still gets passed forward through this text field, but the person's identity is never put at risk. And that brings us to the right side of the screen, where we can see everything that is being approved for delivery on that final report, with the ability to contextualize any of that information. So when we do finally scroll to the bottom, hit share report, and send this off to the people who need to see it, they're only going to see the things that are constructive and helpful, the context they need to go along with it, and in turn, we can go back to these individuals if you chose to identify them in that first stage, and we can help carry on that conversation, address any concerns that may have come up, and really solve any problems that may have been illuminated thanks to this process. So now that you've seen what we've built so far, you might be wondering what's next. Well, you may have noticed that there was no mention of how the data collected can be further dissected, for example, by department or other filtering options. This is due to the fact that our survey tool has grown quite organically from its humble beginnings as a peer-to-peer survey tool. And while it isn't there today, it is a part of the next steps for our survey tool. In addition, we'll be adding in pulse and recurrence options, which will lead to trend analysis over time, and the ongoing investment into the integration of each of our features with one another to leverage and improve the functionality of each of the features themselves, as well as the ecosystem as a whole. Now, I'll pass things to Libby to address some frequently asked questions.
Thanks so much, Nick. Really exciting review of all of our new features there. So absolutely, yes, I've had quite a bit of experience partnering with our customers on these kinds of processes and practices over a number of years now. And actually, in a past life, I worked extensively in heading up company-wide surveys, both in corporate settings and in academic research settings. So there have certainly been some questions and themes that have come up during this time that we thought we might share with you as you kind of embark on this journey of surveys. So one of the first questions I get, as people are starting out on this process, are what are some common hurdles companies experience when running surveys? So look, oftentimes in my past experience when I've done this, too often I would walk into organizations administering these once a year, really clunky, 5-hour-long engagement surveys. And the key issues here were we were asking so much time of people when they were undertaking it. So thinking of that employee experience perspective, first and foremost, that's not always the greatest experience, especially depending on the timing. So if you're particularly busy, that's a lot to ask of people. But we do recognize sometimes that is important. So when people actually decide to undertake these really extensive long surveys, one of the problems we used to encounter then was they'd taken all of this time and effort to answer these questions really thoughtfully, truly believing that something might change, that this feedback would be considered, and that this feedback may potentially make a difference in their work environment. One of the biggest problems we would see there, of course, is when you ask these really long survey questions and when we have a lot of feedback to administer, it takes a really long time for organizations to then analyze those results, to then be able to turn them back around, to be able to then even action them if they decide to action them. So oftentimes I would see, it was often 6 to 12 months actually before organizations were actually able to turn these results around and filter these into actually any meaningful actions. So what we would find here actually is a really ironic process, which is the mechanism by which organizations were trying to measure and improve employee experience was actually really disengaging. Anytime we're asking people to do these things, we really need to respect their time and think about what it is we're trying to achieve. So kind of boiling that all down and reflecting on evaluating those experiences, what I found some of the most common hurdles experienced were when these surveys were designed, potentially not asking the right questions or asking too many questions. Oftentimes I'd see poorly worded questions or what we would call poor survey design. So maybe they were too long and waffly. Maybe the questions were double-barreled, so you're actually asking two things in one, making it difficult to interpret. Or perhaps they were open to interpretation to begin with, so not really getting valid data out of that process. One of the other things we experience as well is sometimes we can over-survey our people with these really long surveys. So survey fatigue is real. We need to be really intentional when we're going about doing these things. And when we're actually administering these surveys, really try and restrict them to be nice and brief and focused. So 5 to 10 minutes maximum when we're thinking about how busy people are. And even 10 minutes can really be pushing it in many instances. Another piece we want to consider in terms of a hurdle is making sure that we consider all voices. So making sure that we're giving everybody equal access to have a voice, and making sure that the questions we're asking are appropriate at the time. If we're using tech as well, making sure people have access to that technology so they're able to make sure their voices are heard through that process. But single-handedly, the biggest issue we'd encounter is the fact that when companies do not close that feedback loop, or they don't close it fast enough, you risk that disengagement piece. So making sure that we're closing that feedback loop really tightly to make sure that those results are super relevant and that they're actually informing and helping us evolve and grow as an organization. So look, my quick tips, and this is just summarizing some of those key hurdles I was talking about, is first to consider timing. So contextually, is this a good time to be asking these kinds of questions? Or the invoice, contextually, what should we be asking about right now, perhaps that we've never focused on before? So I know many of our customers right now are really interested in taking the time and effort to seek out additional feedback around the inclusivity of their practices right now to ensure they're fostering belonging. When we ask ourselves whether these are the right questions, we need to think about what are the focus areas we're interested in. So for example, it could be inclusivity of practices, or perhaps we're looking at well-being, engagement within our roles, role clarity, leader effectiveness. There's all sorts of different things that we could be asking about. Make sure we consider how well written they are. And I suggest, if you're not going to use a validated survey, and I often promote, using research-backed surveys as much as you can, but if you don't have the opportunity to, keep it really simple and maybe run a quick pilot survey with a group of people in your peer network to just test out how those questions are being interpreted and whether they're appropriate. Because we should never forget that, what we intended to ask and then how it was interpreted can often be two very different things, as well as making sure that we're protecting that anonymity that Nick was talking to a little bit earlier, particularly if you've committed to it, really making sure you respect that process. There's no better way to break trust than trying to unpack who said what or not protecting that anonymity. So we really need to make sure we're building trust through that process as well. So take those results, make sure that they're followed up with meaningful, safe, and inclusive one-on-ones. So really asking our leaders to dig in here and making sure that those one-on-ones are really focused on the right things, not trying to unpack specifically who said what, focusing on how do we actually progress and move forward with this information so that it's actually putting your people at the center of that process and making it a positive process. So the biggest advice here is make sure we're intentional, make sure we're thinking about why we're doing this and whether we can actually commit to following through and closing that feedback loop. Don't forget, a poor employee experience of your survey process is actually a really big deal. It's going to drive the opposite results and potentially backfire. So this is a really good question. How can we leverage our survey results to improve our employee experience? Look, I think I've hammered this home that it's really, really important to take action on your survey results. And when we think about what are the specific, tangible ways we can act on this feedback, we also need to think about, well, what are our strongest levers or our strongest drivers of employee experience? And one of the things that we do know from the research is one of the biggest key drivers of a positive employee experience are strong performance management practices. So a great question to ask here is, how can you leverage your employee experience insights to target your performance management practices? And we have lots of ideas that we can share here, particularly from what we've done with our customers. A couple of ideas that come to mind is we can follow up any hotspots from our bigger surveys. So often we still have to conduct those bigger engagement surveys or experience surveys, but we might be able to follow up any core themes with some shorter contextualized quick dive surveys. So, for example, you might find, some hot pockets in, I don't know, diversity and inclusion in particular areas or departments within your organization. Perhaps it's a time to dig a little bit deeper into the root causes and customize a survey for that specific area. You might also look into scheduling some one-on-ones. You could then unpack some of those concerns and next steps, or perhaps even you could conduct a focus group session with some of the key stakeholders to really figure out a way forward and what you can do moving from there. Another thing you can think about as well, and I kind of touched on this as well, is having those really targeted one-on-ones following the dissemination of survey results. And this is really critical. What we can often find is, as a company, particularly through COVID and some of the impacts that has had, we have a lot of organizations focusing on mental health and well-being as such a critical need right now, and certainly something that's cropping up company-wide. What you can do with that is you might follow up and provide leaders in the organization with some global templates for effective one-on-one questions that they can ask in their conversations with their team. And you might ensure that they have a little bit of training along the side in parallel to help them foster that psychological safety and open conversation that they need to have to tackle those conversations effectively. Some other ideas we've seen cropping up, a lot of people at the moment might be feeling a little bit lost when it comes to their career, when it comes to what they're doing and how they're progressing. So lately I've found a key theme emerging is how can we foster more personal growth and development conversations during a time where we're feeling a little bit lost and perhaps don't really know where we're going as an organization because we're pivoting and these are different times. So similar to many of our customers, they've actually followed up these insights by launching their next round of growth and development review conversations. What we've found so far is this has been really effective in tapping into that feeling of progress that human beings love to feel and giving them a chance to reflect on how much they already have achieved through what might seem like a really strange time in the workplace. Perhaps they feel like they've pushed pause when really they've been doing a fantastic job of pivoting their practices. So taking pause to reflect on everything we have done and then thinking about what developmental activities can we focus on right now or can we control in this current climate? Are there cross-functional skills that you could tap into as your company explores pivoting into this unknown territory? We also do have organizations targeting their growth plans right now towards simply staying buoyant and resilient through change, which is really effective and within our control, even if we don't know what the end result will be when we come out of the other side of all of this change. One of the other ways in which we see, and one of the last suggestions I have for today, is I have a lot of organizations as well that are trying to make sure that they're incentivizing and reinforcing these habits of following through with these feedback to have really effective conversations. So they target managers for interventions here. So what we know is that much of a person's experience with an organization is actually driven by interactions with their managers, often more so than the company themselves. So we couple this knowledge with the fact that we know a regular cadence of performance management activities like regular goal setting, frequent feedback, one-on-ones, growth conversations, all of these things will actually collectively drive more positive workplace experiences. So based on all of this knowledge, we have a number of customers that actually provide their managers with performance management adoption targets. So that might be, 100% adoption of SevenGoose activities that have been prescribed by the organization. And they might also incentivize them with engagement metrics that they need to hit. So 85% engagement scores or whatever measure it is that you're using for engagement overall for these different departments. They'll pop those two targets together and they'll link them with some kind of reward, some kind of bonus or reward program, or maybe they'll incorporate this into their success profiles as to what a good manager looks like in this organization. And what they're actually doing here is reinforcing the habits and behaviors that we know strong leaders should demonstrate, as well as the outcomes that these behaviors should elicit with those engagement scores. And of course, making sure that we're achieving those business goals in parallel as well. And it comes as no surprise, of course, that when we see these targets being measured, that they typically correlate. So you'll always have stronger engagement scores if there's a regular adoption of these kinds of activities. And it always helps to incentivize these behaviors as well. So one final question we often get is, how often do we do these? What's a good cadence for running surveys around employee experience? And look, cadences are interesting because, as I mentioned before, timing is critical. I always recommend mapping out your activities to ensure that you can actually have time to follow through with actions, and making sure that functions taking part in these practices actually have the capacity to be taking on board feedback and participating in these programs. I'd still say there's some merit to having those deeper dive, longer surveys every now and then. However, throughout the year, you certainly want to administer shorter, sharper, contextualized surveys like I was talking about before, and making sure you have some key focus areas. A really simple way to do this, I love companies that just have one theme. We can really easily commit to one theme, and we can certainly follow through with that. So lately at SevenGoose, we love to use a regular ENPS that we scatter throughout the year, and we try to do this quarterly. And we often follow these up with some key focus area questions. So lately we've been diving into more health and wellness measures to keep an eye on our resilience as a company as we go through so much change globally. So even if we're short of time, these questionnaires are short and sharp. They're super regular, and I actually really enjoy myself even the opportunity to reflect on how I'm progressing through these changes. What we do is we also follow this up immediately the following week at our all hands meetings. And as a manager myself, I incorporate these initiatives into all of my team meetings. So disseminating the results and ensuring that I'm contextualizing that for my team and unpacking what that actually might mean for my department as well.
So we've reached the end of today's session, and if you would like to find out more, perhaps schedule a deep dive demo of our product even, feel free to reach out on the form that should appear shortly. If for any reason the form doesn't appear or you're unable to fill it out, just visit our website. There you can submit a demo request or browse a variety of other resources, such as the many case studies we've conducted with our clients. But thank you very much for your time today. If you do reach out, I look forward to speaking to you, hopefully, as there's a good chance I'll be on any demos that get booked. I look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.